History often remembers empires for their railways, their wealth, and the flags they planted on foreign soil. What it rarely remembers are the children they left behind and the mothers they were forced to forget. In the heart of Central Africa, under Belgian colonial rule, thousands of African women were systematically exploited by European colonizers who took their bodies without consent and then claimed ownership over the lives that resulted. These women gave birth to children with lighter skin, children the colonizers called evidence of shame, children who did not belong to Africa in the eyes of Europe, yet were never allowed to belong to Europe either. One by one, these children were ripped from their mother's arms, placed into missions, orphanages, and distant institutions, their identities erased, their families silenced, their histories deliberately buried. This is not a story of accidental cruelty. It is a story of policy, power, and calculated theft. A story of how Belgian colonizers created thousands of mixed-race children, then erased their mothers and claimed the children as property of the state. And for decades the world barely spoke about it. Belgian colonial rule in Central Africa did not begin as a distant administrative experiment but as a personal project rooted in ambition, deception, and unchecked power. In the late 19th century, King Leopold II of Belgium presented himself to the world as a humanitarian monarch with a civilizing mission, claiming he wanted to bring progress, Christianity, and trade to the African interior. Behind closed doors, however, his interests were brutally economic. Through diplomatic manipulation and false promises, Leopold secured international recognition of his control over a vast territory in Central Africa, an area that would become known as the Congo Free State. Despite the name, nothing about this land or its people was free. It was not a Belgian colony at first, but the private property of the king himself, ruled not by law but by profit and force. From the moment Belgian authority took hold, the region was transformed into a massive extractions. Rubber, ivory, and later minerals became the lifeblood of Leopold's empire, and the African population was reduced to a labor force compelled through violence. Villages were given quotas they could not possibly meet, and failure was punished with whippings, mutilations, executions, and the destruction of entire communities. The colonial system relied on terror as a method of governance, with the force publique, a colonial army made up of African soldiers under European command, enforcing orders with extreme brutality. Hands were cut off to prove bullets had not been wasted, hostages were taken to ensure obedience, and fear became a daily reality woven into ordinary life. Belgian rule reshaped Central Africa's political and social structures in ways that served colonial needs while dismantling existing systems. Traditional leadership was either co-opted or destroyed, replaced with chiefs who answered to colonial administrators rather than their own people. Borders were drawn without regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities, grouping rival communities together and separating others who had lived as one for generations. These artificial divisions created long-term instability that would persist long after colonial rule officially ended. The colonial state imposed new laws, new hierarchies, and a racial order that placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom, with every aspect of life regulated by this imposed inequality. Religion played a central role in legitimizing Belgian control. Missionaries arrived alongside soldiers and administrators, presenting Christianity as salvation while reinforcing obedience to colonial authority. Churches and mission schools became instruments of cultural transformation, teaching African children to reject their own languages, beliefs, and histories in favor of European values. Conversion was often tied to access to food, protection, or education, making faith less a choice and more a requirement for survival. While some missionaries documented abuses and later spoke out, many were deeply entangled in the colonial system, benefiting from land grants, forced labor, and state protection. As Belgian control shifted from Leopold's personal rule to official state administration in 1908, the most extreme abuses were publicly condemned, but the underlying structure of exploitation remained intact. The Belgian government rebranded its presence as more humane and organized, yet forced labor continued under different names, and racial segregation became more institutionalized. Africans were denied political representation, restricted in movement, and subjected to separate legal systems. Economic benefits flowed overwhelmingly to Belgium, funding infrastructure and wealth in Europe, while Central African communities remained impoverished, their resources extracted and exported with little reinvestment in local well-being. The colonial system extended deeply into the private lives of Africans, particularly women. European administrators, soldiers, and settlers exercised near total power over local populations, and this imbalance created an environment where abuse was normalized and rarely punished. African women were often viewed not as individuals but as part of the colonial landscape, bodies that could be controlled, used, and discarded. Relationships between European men and African women occurred within a framework of coercion, where consent was compromised by fear, dependency, and the threat of violence. These dynamics were not incidental but a direct consequence of a system that denied Africans legal and human equality. Belgian colonial ideology was built on racial theories that portrayed Africans as inferior and childlike, supposedly incapable of self-governance. These beliefs were used to justify paternalistic control and harsh discipline, reinforcing the idea that colonial rule was necessary and beneficial. Education for Africans was deliberately limited, designed to produce obedient workers rather than independent thinkers. Higher education was almost entirely inaccessible, ensuring that power remained firmly in European hands. This deliberate suppression of intellectual and political development would later hinder efforts towards self-determination and national unity. Infrastructure projects such as railways, roads, and ports were often cited as evidence of progress, yet they primarily served the extraction of resources rather than the needs of local population. Africans were forced to build these projects under brutal conditions, with high mortality rates and little compensation. The landscape itself was reshaped to serve colonial economics: forests cleared, rivers exploited, and land seized for plantations and mining operations. Entire communities were displaced to make room for European enterprises, severing people from ancestral lands that held cultural, spiritual, and historical significance. Belgian colonial rule also relied heavily on silence and distance. The realities of life in Central Africa were carefully obscured from the Belgian public and the wider world. Propaganda depicted the colony as a place of order and benevolence, while atrocities were dismissed or denied. When international pressure mounted, reforms were announced but unevenly enforced, allowing the core system of exploitation to continue. The voices of Africans were almost entirely absent from official records, their experiences filtered through colonial reports that minimized suffering and emphasized productivity. By the mid-20th century, resistance began to grow as African workers, soldiers, and intellectuals increasingly challenged Belgian authority. Strikes, protests, and political movements emerged despite repression, signaling a growing awareness of shared oppression and a desire for self-rule. Yet even as independence approached, the damage inflicted by decades of colonial rule had deeply altered Central African societies. Economic dependency, social fragmentation, and psychological trauma were embedded into daily life, shaping the conditions under which post-colonial states would struggle to define themselves, govern effectively, and reclaim histories that had been systematically distorted or erased under Belgian domination and enforced control. Systematic sexual exploitation of African women under Belgian colonial rule was not an accidental byproduct of empire but an embedded feature of a system built on domination, racial hierarchy, and absolute power. From the earliest days of colonial occupation in Central Africa, European men operated within an environment where African women were stripped of legal protection and social autonomy. Colonial law did not recognize African women as citizens with rights, but as subjects whose bodies existed within a framework of control enforced by soldiers, administrators, missionaries, and company agents. This imbalance created conditions in which abuse could occur openly, repeatedly, and without consequence. European authority figures exercised near-total control over African communities, deciding who worked, who moved, who ate, and who. Within this structure, African women were especially vulnerable. Many were coerced into sexual relationships under threat of violence, punishment of family members, loss of food rations, or forced labor. Consent became meaningless in a context where refusal could result in beatings, imprisonment, or death. Women living near military posts, plantations, mines, or administrative centers were particularly exposed, as European men often treated proximity as entitlement. Colonial soldiers and officers frequently took women from villages as temporary wives, a term that disguised coercion as custom. These arrangements were framed as practical solutions to loneliness or discipline among European troops, but in reality they functioned as systems of sexual captivity. Women were expected to provide sex, domestic labor, and obedience, while having no authority over their own lives. They could be discarded at any moment, replaced without explanation, or punished for perceived disobedience. Pregnancy did not bring protection but instead increased vulnerability, as women carrying mixed-race children were often abandoned or stigmatized. Economic dependency intensified exploitation. Colonial policies disrupted traditional economies, forcing men into distant labor camps and leaving women responsible for survival under impossible conditions. Food shortages, taxation, and forced labor quotas meant that many women had to rely on colonial posts or European employers for access to basic necessities. This dependency was exploited by men who used food, protection, or exemptions from punishment as leverage for sexual acts. Survival itself became conditional, turning coercion into routine practice rather than isolated abuse. Racial ideology played a central role in normalizing exploitation. Belgian colonial thinking portrayed African women as hypersexual, primitive, and morally inferior, stereotypes used to justify violence against them. These beliefs stripped women of credibility, making their suffering invisible or dismissed as exaggeration. Complaints of rape or abuse were rarely investigated, and when they were, African women's testimony held little to no weight against that of European men. The legal system was designed to protect colonizers, not the colon. Missionaries, often portrayed as moral guardians, were not separate from this system. While some condemned sexual exploitation, many tolerated or ignored it, prioritizing colonial stability over justice. Mission stations sometimes became sites where pregnant women were sent to give birth in secrecy, shielding European men from scandal rather than protecting women from harm. Moral judgment fell more heavily on African women than on the men who exploited them, reinforcing shame while absolving power. The physical spaces of colonialism were structured to enable abuse. Isolated posts, remote plantations, and labor camps created environments where oversight was minimal and accountability non-existent. European men lived surrounded by armed authority, while African women lived under constant surveillance and threat. The presence of violence as a daily tool of governance blurred boundaries, making sexual coercion just another expression of control. The same force used to extract rubber or minerals was used to claim bodies. Silence was enforced through fear. Women who resisted or spoke out risked violent retaliation, social exclusion, or punishment inflicted on their family. Communities learned that survival depended on compliance, and trauma was absorbed rather than expressed. Oral histories passed down through generations often contain gaps where pain was too dangerous to name, where mothers and grandmothers spoke indirectly or not at all about what had been done to them. Colonial records rarely acknowledged sexual exploitation unless it disrupted order. Reports focused on productivity, discipline, and racial boundaries, not on human suffering. When mixed-race children began to appear in significant numbers, the concern of authorities was not the violence that produced them, but the threat they posed to racial hierarchy. These children became evidence of widespread abuse, but instead of addressing the cause, the colonial state responded by isolating the outcome. For African women, the consequences of exploitation extended far beyond the immediate act. Social stigma followed those associated with Europeans, especially those who bore their children. Women were often rejected by their communities, blamed for relationships they did not choose, and left to raise children in isolation until those children were taken away. Psychological trauma accumulated in silence, compounded by loss, shame, and the constant reminder that the colonial system controlled even the most intimate aspects of life. Sexual exploitation under Belgian rule was sustained by layers of power reinforcing one another: military force, economic dependency, racial ideology, legal exclusion, and social silence. Each layer ensured that abuse could continue without interruption, normalized through routine and protected by institutions. The bodies of African women became contested spaces where empire asserted dominance, where control was enacted not only through labor and land, but through reproduction, intimacy, and violation, embedding violence into the very foundation of colonial rule and everyday existence. Forced pregnancies under colonial power were not isolated incidents of personal abuse, but a predictable outcome of a system that treated African women as resources rather than human beings. Within Belgian-controlled Central Africa, sexual violence, coercive relationships, and unequal power structures created conditions where pregnancy was often imposed rather than chosen. Women lived under constant surveillance and threat, surrounded by men who controlled food, movement, labor assignments, and safety. In such an environment, pregnancy became another consequence of domination, shaped by fear rather than colonial authority removed African women's ability to refuse or negotiate intimate contact. European soldiers, administrators, and settlers operated with near total impunity, and African women had no legal mechanism to protect themselves. Colonial law did not recognize rape as a crime when the victim was African and the perpetrator European, and complaints were either ignored or punished. Women understood that resistance could lead to beatings, imprisonment, or collective punishment against their families and village. Under these conditions, pregnancy was not an accident, but the foreseeable result of systematic coercion. The physical separation of families intensified vulnerability. Colonial labor policies forced African men into distant mines, plantations, or infrastructure projects for months or years at a time. Women were left behind in villages weakened by food shortages, taxation, and constant raids for labor or resource. Without male relatives present, women faced increased exposure to colonial personnel who moved freely through communities. The absence of social protection made women targets,
and pregnancy became one of the many ways colonial power marked their body. Pregnancy carried complex and often devastating consequences for African women. Rather than offering protection or recognition, it increased risk and isolation. Women carrying mixed-race children were viewed with suspicion by both colonial authorities and their own community. Colonial officials often regarded such pregnancies as administrative problems, evidence of racial boundary violations that needed management, rather than human lives that needed care. Communities already traumatized by colonial violence sometimes distanced themselves from women associated with Europeans, not out of cruelty but fear of retaliation or social collapse. Colonial institutions actively shaped how forced pregnancies were handled. Missions and medical facilities often served as sites of concealment, rather than support. Pregnant women were sometimes sent away from their villages to give birth in secrecy, ensuring that European men faced no public accountability. These institutions framed pregnancy as moral failure on the part of the woman, reinforcing shame while erasing the violence that caused it. The language of care masked a reality of control, surveillance and preparation for separation. The colonial obsession with racial classification turned pregnancy into a political issue. Mixed-race children disrupted the rigid hierarchy that placed Europeans above Africans, challenging the myth of separation between ruler and rule. Rather than addressing the exploitation that produced these children, colonial authorities focused on regulating outcomes. Women's wombs became sites of anxiety for the colonial state, places where racial order could be threatened or reinforced, depending on how births were managed. Medical practices under colonial rule often disregarded women's autonomy. Examinations were conducted without consent, and decisions about where and how women gave birth were made by authorities rather than families. Healthcare was not designed to empower women but to monitor reproduction. Records tracked the race of newborns more carefully than the well-being of mothers. Pregnancy was reduced to data, a variable in the administration of empire. For many women, pregnancy meant the loss of control over their own future. Some were forced to continue pregnancies they did not want, while others were punished for attempting to hide or terminate them. Colonial law and missionary morality combined to criminalize women's choices, ensuring that their bodies remained under constant regulation. The physical pain of childbirth was compounded by emotional terror, as women knew that giving birth might lead directly to the loss of their child. The experience of forced pregnancy also fractured generational bonds. Mothers were often prevented from forming lasting relationships with their children, either because the child was taken shortly after birth, or because the mother was moved, dismissed, or punished. The early separation disrupted breastfeeding, bonding, and cultural transmission, leaving emotional wounds that could not be easily healed. For women, motherhood became a site of grief rather than security. Forced pregnancies served the colonial system by reinforcing domination and extraction. They demonstrated power over life itself, showing that colonizers could impose not only labor and obedience, but reproduction. Each pregnancy carried the message that African women's bodies were not their own, that even the creation of life occurred under colonial control. The trauma endured by women was not incidental damage but part of a broader pattern where violence was normalized, hidden, and absorbed into daily existence.
The birth of mixed-race children under Belgian colonial rule exposed a contradiction the colonial system could not resolve. These children were living proof of intimate contact between European men and African women, a reality that clashed with the rigid racial hierarchies colonial authorities worked to maintain. From the moment they were born, mixed-race children were not viewed as individuals but as problems, symbols of moral disorder and racial anxiety that threatened the carefully constructed image of European superiority. Their existence challenged the myth that colonizers ruled from a position of distance and discipline, revealing instead a system built on exploitation and hypocrisy. Colonial ideology depended on clear racial boundaries. Europeans were presented as civilized rulers, Africans as subjects in need of control, and any blurring of this divide was seen as dangerous. Mixed-race children occupied an uncomfortable space within this structure. They could not be fully classified as African due to their European ancestry, yet they were never accepted as European because their African heritage marked them as inferior in the eyes of the colonial state. This in-between status made them targets of suspicion and fear, leading authorities to label them as undesirable rather than acknowledging the violence and coercion that produced them. The term undesirable reflected more than prejudice, it signaled official policy. Colonial administrators worried that mixed-race children would undermine racial discipline by exposing the everyday reality of exploitation. These children were seen as reminders that European men violated the very racial codes they enforced. Instead of addressing this contradiction, the colonial system focused on controlling the children themselves, treating their births as administrative issues that required management, separation and erasure. From early infancy, mixed-race children were subjected to scrutiny. Their skin tone, hair texture and facial features were carefully noted in colonial records, not out of care but to determine their classification and fate. Lighter skin often meant closer surveillance, as these children were perceived as more capable of crossing racial boundaries. The state's obsession with classification reduced children to categories, turning identity into a bureaucratic exercise detached from human experience. Mothers of mixed-race children faced intensified stigma. African women were blamed for pregnancies that resulted from coercion, portrayed as morally suspect or socially disruptive. Communities already under pressure from colonial violence sometimes distanced themselves from these women to avoid attracting attention from authority. The shame imposed on mothers was a deliberate strategy, isolating them and weakening potential resistance by turning victims into targets of judgment. Colonial institutions reinforced this stigma. Missionaries and administrators often framed mixed-race births as evidence of African moral failure rather than European abuse. Religious language was used to cast women as sinners in need of discipline, while European men were quietly protected from scandal. This imbalance ensured that responsibility flowed downward, reinforcing racial and gender hierarchies that placed African women at the bottom. For the children themselves, being labeled undesirable meant growing up under constant threat of removal. Authorities argued that African mothers were unfit to raise mixed-race children, claiming these children needed European guidance to prevent moral and social decay. This justification ignored the fact that African communities had their own systems of care, kinship and education long before colonial rule. The narrative of protection masked an agenda of control, aimed at separating children from African influence, while denying them full European belonging. Education policies reflected this contradiction. Mixed-race children were often excluded from schools designed for Europeans and segregated from African children as well. Special institutions were created to house and educate them, reinforcing their status as outsiders. These schools emphasized obedience, manual labor and loyalty to colonial authority rather than intellectual development, preparing children for marginal roles within the colonial economy rather than full participation in society. The label of undesirability followed these children into adolescence and adulthood. Employment opportunities were limited, social mobility restricted, and personal relationships scrutinized. Colonial authorities feared that mixed-race individuals might challenge racial boundaries by seeking equality with Europeans or leadership among Africans. Surveillance and regulation became tools to prevent this perceived threat, turning everyday life into a series of monitored interactions. Identity formation under these conditions was deeply fractured. Mixed-race children were denied access to their African heritage through separation from mothers and communities, while simultaneously rejected by European society. Language, culture and family connections were stripped away, leaving individuals to navigate a world that offered no place of belonging. The emotional toll of this exclusion was compounded by the knowledge that their existence was treated as a mistake rather than a human reality. Colonial discourse often described mixed-race children in clinical or alarmist terms, portraying them as social risks rather than people. Reports warned of instability, criminality or moral confusion, projections that revealed colonial fears rather than actual behavior. These narratives justified continued intervention, allowing authorities to claim that segregation and control were necessary for social order. The concept of undesirability also served a broader political function. By framing mixed-race children as problems, colonial authorities diverted attention away from systemic abuse. The focus shifted from the actions of European men to the supposed consequences embodied by children, turning victims into symbols of disorder. This inversion protected the legitimacy of colonial rule by placing blame on those least able to defend themselves. Over time, the number of mixed-race children grew, making complete erasure impossible. Their presence exposed the limits of colonial control, revealing cracks in the racial order that could not be fully sealed. Yet rather than prompting reflection or reform, the colonial system responded with tighter regulation, deeper segregation, and more aggressive attempts to manage reproduction and family life. The legacy of being labeled undesirable did not end with childhood. Long after colonial rule weakened, many mixed-race individuals carried the psychological weight of rejection, uncertainty and loss. Their histories were fragmented, their family ties broken, their identities shaped by policies that denied their humanity. The label imposed at birth became a lifelong burden, shaping how they were seen by others and how they understood themselves within societies still grappling with the aftermath of colonial domination. Colonial fear of racial contamination was a central obsession within Belgian rule, shaping policies, attitudes and daily practices across Central Africa. This fear did not emerge naturally but was deliberately cultivated to protect a system built on racial hierarchy and economic exploitation. European authority depended on the belief that clear racial boundaries separated rulers from the ruled, civilization from primitiveness, power from submission, Any blurring of these lines threatened not only social order but the moral justification of colonial domination itself. The presence of Europeans in Africa was framed as temporary and superior, a mission rather than emerging. Colonizers insisted on distance, emphasizing segregation in housing, education, law, and social life. Europeans lived in separate quarters, had exclusive clubs, schools and hospitals, and followed legal systems that treated them differently from Africans. This separation was presented as natural and necessary, reinforcing the idea that racial difference was absolute and immutable. Yet everyday colonial life constantly contradicted this narrative, especially through intimate contact between European men and African women. Mixed-race children became the focal point of colonial anxiety because they embodied this contradiction. Their existence revealed that racial boundaries were neither natural nor secure. To colonial authorities, these children symbolized the collapse of discipline, the failure of European men to maintain the distance they demanded of others. Rather than confronting this hypocrisy, the colonial state redirected fear toward the children themselves, portraying them as threats to social stability and racial purity. The language of contamination borrowed heavily from pseudo-scientific racial theories popular in Europe at the time. Africans were described as biologically inferior, morally unstable, and socially backward, while Europeans were portrayed as carriers of civilization. The idea that African blood could weaken or degrade European lineage fueled panic about degeneration. Mixed-race individuals were framed as unpredictable, supposedly inheriting the worst traits of both worlds, a narrative used to justify exclusion and control. This fear shaped how colonial institutions responded to reproduction. Pregnancy between European men and African women was not treated as a private matter but as a political issue requiring regulation. Authorities monitored births, recorded racial classifications, and intervened in family structures to prevent what they saw as the spread of racial ambiguity. Women's bodies became sites of surveillance, and children became objects of policy rather than members of families. Colonial administrators worried that mixed-race children raised within African communities might identify with Africans, while possessing enough European features to challenge authority. This perceived threat led to policies of removal and segregation. By taking children away from their mothers and placing them in missions or institutions, authorities believed they could neutralize the risk of racial confusion. The goal was not inclusion but containment, ensuring these children did not disrupt the existing hierarchy. European women played a symbolic role in reinforcing fear of contamination. Their presence in colonies was often cited as a solution to moral disorder, based on the belief that European men would be less likely to engage in relationships with African women if European families were established. European women were portrayed as guardians of racial purity, while African women were cast as temptations or dangers. This framing further dehumanized African women, reducing them to sources of moral and biological risk. Fear of contamination also influenced social interaction. Even minimal intimacy between Africans and Europeans was scrutinized. Shared meals, physical proximity or emotional bonds were discouraged or punished. Africans who adopted European dress, language or customs were sometimes viewed with suspicion, accused of overstepping their assigned place. The colonial system depended on visible difference, and any sign of convergence threatened its logic. Education was tightly controlled to prevent racial mixing of ideas as well as bodies. African education was limited and vocational, designed to produce obedient laborers rather than critical thinkers. Mixed-race children were often placed in separate schools where their potential was managed rather than developed. Teaching emphasized discipline and loyalty rather than empowerment, reflecting fear that education could enable challenges to racial order. Religion reinforced these anxieties in subtle ways. While Christianity preached spiritual equality, colonial interpretations often emphasized earthly hierarchy. Missionaries sometimes echoed fears of contamination, framing African culture as corrupting and European influence as purifying. Conversion did not erase racial boundaries but reinforced them, with African Christians remaining subordinate within church structures. Colonial fear of racial contamination also shaped labor policy. Africans were kept in positions that emphasized physical work, while Europeans occupied roles of management and authority. Mixed-race individuals were often restricted to intermediate or marginal roles, never fully trusted with power. This ensured that racial hierarchy remained visible in economic life, reinforcing social divisions through material inequality. The obsession with purity revealed deep insecurity within colonial rule. If European superiority were truly natural and unchallenged, it would not require such constant reinforcement. The elaborate systems of classification, segregation and surveillance exposed fear rather than confidence. Colonial authority depended on managing appearances as much as realities, policing bodies and relationships to maintain an illusion of order. Over time, the fear of contamination intensified rather than diminished. As more mixed-race children were born, colonial authorities faced evidence that their system could not fully control human interaction. Instead of adapting, they doubled down on regulation,
tightening laws and expanding institutions designed to manage different. This response deepened trauma, separating families and reinforcing stigma without resolving underlying violence. The legacy of this fear extended beyond colonial rule. Ideas about purity, hierarchy, and belonging persisted in post-colonial societies, shaping attitudes toward identity and difference. Mixed-race individuals often continued to face suspicion or exclusion, carrying the weight of colonial anxiety into new political realities. The fear that once justified domination did not disappear with independence, but lingered in social structures and personal histories shaped by decades of imposed division and enforced separation. State and church involvement in the removal of children under Belgian colonial rule was not a hidden or accidental practice, but a coordinated system justified through law, morality, and administration. Colonial authorities and religious institutions worked together to define which children belonged where, who was fit to raise them, and how their lives should be shaped. This collaboration allowed the colonial system to present child removal as protection and guidance, while masking its role in enforcing racial hierarchy and erasing African family. The colonial state viewed children not primarily as members of families but as future subjects whose identities needed regulation. Mixed-race children in particular were seen as administrative concerns that required intervention. Officials argued that African mothers were incapable of providing proper upbringing, education, or moral guidance, despite the fact that African societies had long-standing systems of kinship and child-rearing. These claims were rooted not in evidence but in racial ideology that equated European culture with superiority and African life with deficiency. Churches provided the moral framework that made these policies appear righteous. Missionaries framed child removal as an act of salvation, presenting themselves as rescuers lifting children out of supposedly immoral or primitive environments. Religious language transformed separation into duty, recasting trauma as spiritual necessity. Baptism, schooling, and discipline were offered as proof that the church acted in the best interest of the child, even as mothers were denied the right to consent or object. Legal mechanisms reinforced this collaboration. Colonial laws granted administrators broad authority over African families, allowing them to declare children wards of the state or church with minimal justification. Decisions were often made without formal hearings, documentation, or parental involvement. Once a child was classified as needing protection or guidance, removal could happen quickly and permanently. Mothers were rarely informed of where their children were taken or whether they would ever return. Mission institutions became the primary destinations for removed children. Orphanages, boarding schools, and religious compounds housed thousands of children who were not orphans in any meaningful sense. Many had living mothers and extended families who were forcibly separated from them. Within these institutions, children were stripped of their names, languages, and cultural practices. European names replaced African ones and religious instruction replaced traditional knowledge, reshaping identity under the guise of care. The church's authority within colonial society gave legitimacy to state actions. Administrators relied on missionaries to manage children, while missionaries relied on state power to enforce removals. This mutual dependence blurred the line between governance and religion. Acts of violence and separation were softened through sermons and doctrine, making resistance appear sinful or misguided. Families who objected risked punishment, exclusion, or retaliation. Women bore the greatest burden of this system. African mothers were portrayed as morally suspect, irresponsible, or dangerous influences, especially if they had relationships with European men. Pregnancy itself could trigger scrutiny, and childbirth often marked the beginning of surveillance rather than celebration. Mothers were pressured to surrender children or had them taken outright, their grief dismissed as emotional weakness or cultural backwardness. Children experienced removal as sudden rupture. Many were taken at very young ages, before forming stable memories, while others were old enough to remember being pulled from their homes. The journey to missions or institutions was often the last contact they had with their family. Letters were rare, visits discouraged or forbidden, and reunification almost never planned. Separation was not temporary but designed to be permanent. Education within these institutions reinforced colonial goals. Children were taught obedience, discipline, and loyalty to colonial authority. Curriculum focused on manual labor, domestic service, or religious instruction rather than intellectual development. The aim was not empowerment but control, producing individuals who would fit into marginal roles within the colonial system. Emotional needs were secondary to order and productivity. The church also acted as a gatekeeper of morality, deciding which children could remain and which must be removed. Religious leaders judged family structures through a European lens, condemning polygamy, extended kinship, or spiritual practices as immoral. These judgments ignored context and history, reducing complex societies to stereotypes. Removal became a way to enforce cultural conformity while weakening African social bonds. State records framed removals as success. Reports emphasized numbers educated, baptized, or trained, while omitting the cost to families and communities. The pain of separation was absent from official language, replaced by statistics and moral claim. This bureaucratic framing allowed the system to continue with minimal scrutiny, presenting harm as progress. Resistance existed but was dangerous. Families who attempted to hide children, flee, or protest risked punishment, including imprisonment or violence. The power imbalance between colonizers and colonized made sustained opposition nearly impossible. Over time, fear and exhaustion replaced resistance, and separation became normalized as an unavoidable reality of colonial life. The collaboration between state and church also protected European men from accountability. By focusing on children rather than the circumstances of their conception, the system shifted attention away from exploitation. Child removal addressed the visible outcome of abuse while leaving its causes untouched. European fathers were rarely named, questioned, or held responsible, while African mothers bore the consequences. As children grew older, the impact of removal deepened. Many struggled with identity, belonging, and memory, caught between cultures that both rejected them. The church offered belonging conditioned on obedience, while the state offered limited opportunity without equality. The loss of family knowledge, language, and history created lasting gaps that could not be filled by institutional care. The long-term effects extended beyond individual lives. Entire communities were weakened as generational continuity was broken. Knowledge that would have been passed from parent to child was interrupted, and trust in institutions eroded. The trauma of removal became part of collective memory, shaping how people understood authority. Family and state and church involvement in child removal revealed the true priorities of colonial rule. Protection was invoked to justify control, morality used to excuse violence, and care employed as a language to mask domination. The collaboration allowed empire to reach into the most intimate spaces of life, redefining.
Children taken from mothers without consent was one of the most devastating practices under Belgian colonial rule, cutting through the most fundamental human bond and redefining motherhood as something conditional and fragile. Removal was rarely preceded by dialogue or agreement. It was sudden, enforced by authority, and justified through laws and moral claims that denied African women agency over their own children. Mothers often learned of the decision only when officials arrived, sometimes accompanied by soldiers or missionaries, leaving no space for resistance. Consent was rendered meaningless in a colonial context where power was absolute. African women were not considered legal equals, and their objections held no weight against colonial authority. Administrators claimed the right to decide what was best for children, framing African motherhood as inadequate or dangerous. These judgments were based not on individual circumstances but on racial assumptions that portrayed African women as incapable of moral guidance or proper care. The result was a system where motherhood existed at the mercy of the state. The moment of separation was often traumatic and public. Children were taken from homes, villages, or mission compounds while mothers watched helplessly. Crying, pleading, and physical resistance were met with force or threats. In some cases, children were seized during routine visits or medical checkups, turning ordinary moments into points of irreversible loss. The shock of sudden separation left mothers disoriented, unable to process what had happened before the child was gone. Colonial officials portrayed removal as an act of protection, claiming children were being rescued from poverty, immorality, or cultural backwardness. This narrative ignored the violence inflicted by separation itself. Mothers were rarely given explanations, timelines, or information about where their children were taken. Many never learned whether their children were alive, where they lived, or what names they were given. Uncertainty became a form of ongoing punishment. For mothers, the loss extended beyond emotional pain. Children were central to social identity, economic survival, and cultural continuity. Removing a child meant removing a woman's role within her family and community. Mothers were often left stigmatized, viewed as failures or suspects under colonial scrutiny. Some communities distanced themselves from women whose children were taken, fearing attention from authorities or collective punishment. The process of removal was deliberately designed to prevent reunification. Once taken, children were placed in institutions far from their communities, sometimes moved repeatedly to sever any remaining connection. Visits were discouraged or forbidden, and correspondence was tightly controlled. Mothers who attempted to locate their children faced bureaucratic barriers, intimidation, or outright refusal. Separation was not temporary care but a permanent rupture. Children experienced removal as a loss they could not articulate. Younger children were too small to understand what was happening, while older ones carried memories of their mothers that faded over time. The absence of familiar voices, languages, and routines created confusion and fear. Institutional life replaced family warmth with discipline and hierarchy. teaching children to suppress grief and adapt quickly to survive. The denial of consent extended into childbirth itself. In some cases, women were pressured to surrender children immediately after birth. Before bonds could form, hospitals and mission clinics became points of interception, where authority intervened at the most vulnerable moment. Mothers were often weak, isolated and dependent, making resistance impossible. The newborn was taken while the mother was still recovering, transforming birth into loss. Colonial discourse framed maternal grief as emotional excess or cultural weakness. Women's pain was dismissed as irrational, reinforcing stereotypes that Africans were incapable of responsible parenting. This dismissal allowed authorities to ignore suffering while maintaining a self-image of benevolence. By denying the legitimacy of maternal attachment, the colonial system justified its intrusion into family life. Removal without consent also functioned as a warning to other communities. Learned that compliance was safer than resistance, that challenging authority could lead to the loss of children or worse. Fear spread quietly, shaping behavior and silencing mothers taught daughters to avoid attention, to be cautious around colonial spaces, knowing that visibility carried risk. The practice reinforced gendered control. African men, already weakened by forced labor and displacement, were often absent or powerless to intervene. Women bore the full weight of separation, blamed for circumstances beyond their control. This isolation weakened family structures and reduced the ability of communities to resist colonial intrusion. Records of removal were kept by the state, but they told only one side of the story. Files documented dates, classifications and destinations while omitting the human cost, the cries of mothers, the confusion of children, and the lasting damage to families were absent from reports. Bureaucracy transformed violence into procedure, making harm appear orderly and justified. As years passed, some mothers continued to search, holding on to fragments of hope. Others were forced to grieve without closure, mourning children who were neither dead nor present. This unresolved loss shaped emotional lives, affecting relationships, trust, and self-worth. Grief became internalized, carried quietly to avoid further punishment or judgment. Children grew up with fragmented identities, often unaware of the circumstances of their removal. When they learned the truth, it came as a shock, revealing that separation was not an act of care but of power. The absence of consent haunted both sides of the bond, shaping how mothers remembered and how children understood their origins. The practice of taking children without consent revealed the depth of colonial control. It showed that empire did not stop at land or labor but extended into bodies, families and emotions. By denying African women the right to keep their children, the colonial system asserted authority over life itself, redefining love and belonging according to rules that served domination rather than humanity. Placement in missions, orphanages and institutions became the final stage of a carefully managed colonial process designed to erase origins and reshape identity. Once children were taken from their mothers, the colonial system needed spaces where separation could be enforced, monitored and justified. Missions and institutions served this purpose perfectly, presented as places of care and education while functioning as tools of discipline, assimilation and control. These spaces were deliberately removed from African social life, both physically and culturally, ensuring that children grew up disconnected from their families and communities. Missions were often the first destination. Operated by religious orders, they were portrayed as sanctuaries where children would be protected, educated, and guided toward moral living. In reality, they were tightly regulated environments where obedience was valued above all else. Daily routines were rigid, structured around prayer, labor, and instruction designed to instill submission. Children learned quickly that survival depended on compliance, silence, and the suppression of memory. Orphanages became repositories for children who were not orphans in any meaningful sense. Many had living mothers, relatives, and entire communities searching for them. The label orphan functioned as a legal and moral convenience, allowing institutions to claim authority over children without acknowledging the violence of separation. Records were altered or simplified, erasing family ties and replacing them with institutional identity. A child's past became irrelevant once they entered the system. Names were often the first thing to be taken. African names were replaced with European or biblical ones, symbolizing a break from origin and ancestry. Language followed the same pattern. Children were punished for speaking their mother tongues and rewarded for using European languages. Over time, communication with family became impossible even if contact were allowed. Language loss ensured cultural loss, making return increasingly unlikely. Institutional life was emotionally barren, affection was scarce and conditional,
often tied to good behavior or religious performance. Punishment was frequent and harsh, reinforcing fear and obedience. Children learned not to ask questions about their past, as curiosity was discouraged and sometimes punished. Silence became a coping mechanism, a way to navigate an environment where authority was absolute and unchallengeable. Education within these institutions was limited and purposeful. Academic learning was secondary to moral instruction and vocational training. Boys were prepared for manual labor or low-level administrative roles, while girls were trained for domestic service. The goal was not personal development, but usefulness within the colonial economy. Aspirations beyond assigned roles were discouraged, reinforcing a sense of limitation and dependency. Separation from family also meant separation from memory. Without stories, rituals, or elders to transmit history, children grew up without a sense of belonging. Identity was shaped by institutional narratives that emphasized gratitude toward the church and state, rather than connection to family or land. Children were taught to see their removal as a rescue, internalizing a version of their story that blamed their origins for their displacement. Orphanages and institutions were often overcrowded and under-resourced. Children lived in dormitories where individuality was erased in favor of uniformity. Personal possessions were minimal, and privacy non-existent. Illness spread easily, and care was inconsistent. Yet these conditions were rarely questioned by colonial authorities, who measured success by order and numbers, rather than well-being. The distance between institutions and African communities was intentional. Physical separation made visits difficult and discouraged contact. Even when mothers knew where their children were placed, travel restrictions, cost, and fear of punishment made reunification nearly impossible. Institutions became islands of colonial control, insulated from scrutiny and shielded by moral authority. Religion played a central role in shaping daily life. Children were taught to associate obedience with virtue and resistance with sin. Faith was used to explain suffering, framing hardship as discipline or divine test. This spiritualization of pain discouraged questioning and reframed injustice as moral necessity. Over time, many children internalized guilt for their own separation, believing they had been saved from something shameful. As children grew older, the promise of protection faded. Adolescents were often released into colonial society with little support, expected to navigate a world that still rejected them. Lacking family networks, cultural grounding, and equal opportunity, many struggled to find stability. Institutions that claimed responsibility for their upbringing rarely offered long-term assistance, revealing the limits of colonial care. For girls, institutional placement often led directly into domestic service within European households. This transition maintained proximity to colonial power while reinforcing subordination. Girls trained in obedience and silence were particularly vulnerable to further exploitation, repeating patterns of control that had defined their early lives. Institutions thus became pipelines rather than sanctuaries. The psychological impact of institutionalization was profound. Children learned to detach from emotion as a survival strategy. Attachment was risky in environments where separation had already proven devastating. Many carried unresolved grief, confusion, and anger into adulthood, emotions they lacked language to express. Institutional discipline replaced familial love, leaving gaps that could not be easily filled. Colonial reports celebrated these institutions as evidence of benevolence. Numbers of children housed, baptized, or trained were highlighted as achievements. Missing from these accounts were the stories of mothers searching, children crying, and identities erased. The success of the system was measured by efficiency rather than humanity. Placement in missions and orphanages was not a neutral response to circumstance, but a deliberate strategy to manage the consequences of colonial exploitation. By isolating children from their origins, the colonial system sought to control future generations, shaping individuals who would not challenge the order that had separated them. These institutions stood as quiet instruments of power, transforming loss into routine and erasure into policy, leaving behind lives shaped by absence, discipline, and the lingering echo of a home that was taken but never forgotten. Erasure of African identity and family ties was one of the most insidious aspects of Belgian colonial policies, targeting the core of personal and collective existence. From the moment children were removed from their mothers and placed into missions, orphanages, or other institutions, colonial authorities began a systematic process of identity stripping that extended beyond physical separation. Names were changed, languages forbidden, cultural practices suppressed, and family histories erased, all under the guise of moral guidance and protection. This process was not accidental but deliberate, aiming to produce individuals loyal to colonial authority rather than to their own community. One of the first steps in erasing identity was renaming. Children were given European or biblical names to replace African ones, a symbolic severing of their connection to ancestry. Names carry history, lineage and belonging, and by imposing new names the colonial system attempted to rewrite each child's story. Parents' names, family histories and community roles were omitted from records, replaced with bureaucratic identifiers that reduced human beings to administrative entry. This act of renaming was a daily reminder to children that their past belonged to someone else, that their origins were irrelevant to the authority that now claimed their lives. Language suppression reinforced this erasure. Children were punished for speaking their mother tongues and instructed exclusively in European languages. This practice did more than facilitate control. It severed the natural transmission of culture, folklore and social knowledge. Oral traditions, proverbs, and local histories, which formed the backbone of African identity, were systematically erased. As children grew, they could no longer communicate with extended family members who remained in their communities, further isolating them from their roots and making reunion or cultural continuity increasingly difficult. Family ties were intentionally dismantled. The act of removing children was often accompanied by strict prohibitions on communication. Visits were discouraged or forbidden, letters were censored or intercepted, and relocation to distant institutions made travel nearly impossible. Mothers, siblings and grandparents were left in uncertainty, unable to maintain daily connections. Over time, the lack of contact normalized absence, conditioning both parents and children to accept separation as inevitable and irreversible. This destruction of family bonds served colonial interests by preventing communities from forming resistance or maintaining cohesion. Cultural practices were another target. Clothing, food, rituals, and spiritual observances were replaced with European equivalents or strictly regulated alternatives. Traditional dress was banned, ceremonial practices forbidden, and indigenous beliefs ridiculed or criminalized. Children were taught to see their cultural background as inferior, morally corrupt or primitive, fostering internalized shame. This cultural erasure extended into religion, where baptism and instruction in Christian doctrine were framed as redemption from African backwardness. The combination of physical separation and cultural suppression created generations disconnected from their heritage. Education in institutions reinforced this process. Curricula emphasized obedience, vocational training and moral instruction aligned with colonial values rather than the child's own cultural context. Knowledge about local history, geography and society was absent or denigrated, replaced with lessons designed to prepare children for roles subordinate to colonial authority. Critical thinking or personal agency was discouraged, ensuring that identity formation was mediated entirely by colonial expectations. Over time, children internalized the idea that their African heritage was irrelevant, dangerous or shameful. Psychological effects were profound and long-lasting. Children internalized the separation, cultural denigration and loss of family as a natural order rather than an imposed injustice. Feelings of guilt, confusion and disorientation became common, as children struggled to reconcile institutional narratives with fragmented memories of home. Many developed a dual consciousness, learning to navigate colonial society while suppressing or forgetting their origins. This internal conflict often persisted into adulthood, affecting relationships, self-esteem and social belonging. The erasure of identity also served political purpose. By severing children from families and communities, colonial authorities weakened social cohesion, making resistance less likely. Communities lost, not only children but the potential future leaders and knowledge holders who might have preserved cultural continuity. Removing children disrupted lineage, inheritance and kinship networks, undermining the social fabric that had sustained African societies for generations. The colonial system thus extended its power not only through coercion, but through the systematic dismantling of community structure. Church involvement reinforced identity erasure. Religious instruction framed African beliefs and practices as sinful, backward or morally corrupt. Children were taught that salvation came only through assimilation into European norms, further alienating them from their heritage. Rituals of initiation, worship and communal life were replaced with Christian ceremonies that reinforced obedience and separation from African roots. The Church's authority legitimized state control, making cultural suppression appear morally righteous. Records and documentation played a role in consolidating erasure. Birth certificates, school records and institutional files often omitted parents' names, village affiliations and ethnic identity. Children were cataloged by date, institution or race rather than by family ties or community belonging. These records became the official version of reality, ensuring that historical memory favored colonial narratives over individual or collective experience. Even attempts to reclaim identity later were complicated by incomplete or manipulated documentation. The loss of identity extended into adulthood. Individuals who survived institutionalization often struggled to reconnect with families or communities, facing language barriers, cultural gaps and emotional estrangement. Identity reconstruction became a painful and uncertain process, complicated by lingering internalized shame and social stigmas. Adults carried the legacy of erasure into personal, professional and social spheres, affecting their ability to form relationships, assert rights and transmit culture to future generations. Resistance existed but was constrained. Some children secretly maintained cultural practices, language or stories, preserving fragments of identity despite institutional pressure. Others formed bonds within institutions that substituted for family, creating new networks of support. These acts of quiet defiance allowed elements of African culture and family knowledge to survive, though often in attenuated or transformed forms. Even so, the overall effect of erasure was pervasive, shaping collective memory and social structure for generations. Erasure of African identity and family ties under Belgian colonial rule was therefore both strategic and systemic. It relied on physical separation, language suppression, cultural replacement, institutional control, and ideological framing to reshape individuals according to colonial objectives. The process dismantled families, fragmented communities and imposed a lasting psychological and social burden on children and mothers alike. Identity, culture and belonging were subordinated to power, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate violence of separation, affecting
long-term trauma. Silence and delayed justice were the enduring consequences of Belgian colonial exploitation, particularly the systemic removal of children and the sexual abuse of African women. The immediate suffering of mothers and children was compounded over decades, embedding deep psychological, social and cultural wounds that transcended individual experiences. Trauma was not only the result of physical separation but also the prolonged erasure of identity, memory and belonging, creating a multi-generational impact that colonial authorities neither recognized nor sought to mitigate. The initial trauma began with the act of removal itself. Mothers were stripped of agency and forced to witness their children being taken, often under threat or through coercion. The suddenness of separation left psychological scars manifesting as grief, anxiety, and depression. Many mothers internalized guilt, blaming themselves for circumstances entirely beyond their control, a narrative reinforced by colonial authorities who framed child removal as a form of protection or moral correction. Children, for their part, experienced confusion, fear, and abandonment, unsure why the adults they trusted had disappeared from their lives. These early traumas were formative, shaping attachment, trust and emotional development in ways that would persist throughout life. Silence was another enforced consequence. The colonial system deliberately suppressed discussion of abuse and removal, ensuring that the voices of mothers, children, and entire communities were marginalized or erased from official records. Families were discouraged from speaking about lost children, either through intimidation, cultural shaming, or fear of retaliation. Communities learned that grief and anger could provoke further punishment, turning silence into a survival mechanism. Over time, this cultivated a culture in which trauma was carried privately, unacknowledged and unresolved, leaving deep emotional residue. The absence of legal recourse compounded trauma. Colonial laws favored European perpetrators and institutional authority over African victims, leaving women powerless to seek justice for sexual exploitation or child removal. Complaints were ignored, evidence disregarded, and perpetrators rarely held accountable. Even when policies shifted under international scrutiny, enforcement remained inconsistent and partial. This systemic denial of justice reinforced feelings of helplessness and betrayal, signaling that suffering was expected to be endured rather than addressed. Generational trauma emerged as children who survived institutionalization reached adulthood. Many had been denied familial love, cultural grounding, and personal autonomy. Identity formation was disrupted, leaving individuals vulnerable to ongoing feelings of alienation and inadequacy. Some tried to reconnect with their biological families but encountered linguistic, cultural, or bureaucratic barriers. Others carried the experience of separation into their own parenting, perpetuating cycles of anxiety, detachment, or communities that had lost significant numbers of children struggled to maintain cultural continuity, social cohesion, and knowledge transmission, creating collective wounds alongside individual ones. Silence extended into public memory. For decades, colonial abuses were obscured, minimized, or justified in historical accounts, leaving survivors with little validation. Stories of women who were exploited and children who were stolen were rarely included in education, media, or national discourse. Survivors often faced disbelief or dismissal when they attempted to recount experiences, reinforcing isolation and undermining the legitimacy of their trauma. This absence of acknowledgement created a social environment in which suffering was invisible, and accountability was deferred indefinitely. Delayed justice became a long-term struggle. Only decades later, after colonial rule ended, did efforts to document abuses, reunite families, or provide reparations begin to gain traction. Legal and moral recognition lagged behind lived experience, leaving survivors without closure. Bureaucratic obstacles, lost records and fading memories complicated efforts to reclaim identities or pursue restitution. The passage of time did not heal trauma but often intensified it, as the continuing absence of justice reminded survivors that the wrongs committed had never been fully addressed. The psychological impact of trauma intersected with social marginalization. Survivors of removal, especially mixed-race children, often occupied liminal spaces in society, facing discrimination, identity confusion, and limited opportunity. The erasure of family ties meant that many lacked social networks, cultural knowledge, or community support. These social gaps reinforced emotional wounds, leaving survivors vulnerable to exploitation, poverty, and social exclusion. Trauma became both personal and structural, embedded in social hierarchies created and maintained by colonial power. Silence also affected cultural memory. When entire generations of children were removed, communities lost knowledge bearers who would have transmitted language, traditions, and rituals. The absence of these individuals disrupted continuity, leaving gaps in cultural practices and collective identity. Ceremonies, histories, and familial lineages were interrupted, eroding the social fabric and making recovery more challenging. Trauma was thus compounded by cultural loss, creating multi-layered wounds that intertwined personal suffering with communal dislocation. Delayed justice manifested not only in legal terms but also in recognition and reparations. Advocacy efforts to reclaim children, restore identities, or provide compensation were often met with bureaucratic resistance or political hesitation. Survivors had to confront institutions that had actively participated in or sanctioned abuse, navigating complex systems of accountability decades after the fact. The emotional labor of pursuing justice became an extension of the trauma, as survivors revisited experiences of separation, exploitation, and institutional neglect. Healing from trauma was further complicated by intergenerational effects. Children of survivors, growing up with parents who carried unprocessed grief and loss, often absorbed aspects of that trauma. Anxiety, fear, and distrust were transmitted subtly through behavior, communication patterns, and familial dynamics. Communities carried collective grief that was rarely named or acknowledged, perpetuating cycles of psychological and social stress long after the end of colonial rule. The delayed acknowledgement of abuse also created tension between memory and history. While survivors lived with first-hand knowledge of what occurred, official narratives often ignored, minimized, or sanitized events. The gap between lived experience and recorded history left survivors to struggle for validation, and society at large remained unaware of the scale and severity of harm. This discrepancy reinforced marginalization, silenced voices, and perpetuated the invisibility of trauma. Colonial violence was thus extended temporally, with the consequences of removal, exploitation, and identity erasure persisting across decades. Trauma was not confined to the moment of abuse but carried forward through social, cultural, and psychological channels. Silence allowed power to continue exerting influence even after colonial administration ended, and delayed justice meant that accountability was rarely immediate or sufficient. The combination of these factors created enduring wounds for individuals, families, and communities alike, shaping the social and emotional landscape of post-colonial Central Africa for generations. The story of Belgian colonial abuse, of African women exploited, children stolen, and identities erased, is not just a historical account, it is a testament to the resilience of those who survived unimaginable suffering. While colonial authorities sought to sever bonds, erase culture, and impose control, the human spirit endured. Generations carried memory, preserved fragments of language, traditions, and familial love, and passed them on despite systematic attempts at obliteration. The trauma inflicted cannot be undone, but acknowledgement, documentation, and remembrance are acts of justice in themselves. Recognizing these histories forces societies to confront the consequences of power unrestrained by morality, to honor the lives stolen, and to ensure that such violations of human dignity are never repeated. The legacy is a call to bear witness, restore what can be restored, and commit to a world where no child, no mother, and no community is ever treated as expendable. It is a reminder that history must be faced fully, not as abstract fact, but as the lived reality.